I never imagined that owning a quiet piece of land on the outskirts of town would turn into a full-blown nightmare. But life has a way of surprising you, especially when greedy people smell money where it doesn't belong. It all began when I inherited my family's farmland from my grandfather, a vast stretch of untouched land just beyond the city limits. At first, it felt like a blessing, a place where I could escape the chaos of the world, a sanctuary where I could breathe freely and maybe build my dream home someday. But apparently, paradise attracts more than just peace. It attracts people who think they're entitled to what isn't theirs. The first sign of trouble was subtle. I noticed construction trucks passing along the old dirt road that ran through my property. At first, I assumed they were working on nearby plots for a new housing development. I shrugged it off, thinking nothing could happen without my knowledge. Weeks later, a polite knock came at my door. It was a representative from the HOA of a new housing subdivision claiming they had plans to legally annex parts of my land into their development. I laughed at the absurdity. Annex my land? You must be joking, I said. They smiled, handing me a stack of documents that were almost incomprehensible, full of legal jargon and references to zoning laws I had never heard of. Curiosity turned to alarm when I finally read through the paperwork. Somehow, these people had convinced themselves, and apparently the city, that they had rights to portions of my property. They weren't asking, they were telling. They said they intended to build 96 homes on my land, claiming some old easement and paperwork that supposedly gave them permission. I called my attorney immediately. After a lengthy consultation, my lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. The documents were fraudulent. There was no legal claim, no easement, no zoning change that allowed them to touch a single inch of my property, but the HOA didn't care. Within weeks, construction crews began pouring foundations, erecting walls, and marking plots as if I didn't even exist. Every morning I would drive past my land, watching as my quiet sanctuary slowly transformed into a mini-city of concrete and chaos. I could feel the rage building inside me, but I also knew I had to stay patient. The last thing I wanted was to make a rash decision that could jeopardize the case I was preparing. This was a legal battle, and in legal battles, timing is everything. I spent days gathering every scrap of evidence I could find, old deeds from my grandfather, tax documents proving I had paid property taxes for decades, even letters from neighbors who remembered the property boundaries. Meanwhile, the HOA continued constructing homes, oblivious to the fact that every brick they laid was one step closer to their undoing. People began to move in, thinking the homes were legitimate. Friends and family warned me not to provoke them, suggesting I simply sell the land and walk away. But giving in was never an option, not when these people had already crossed every boundary, not just physically, but morally. At night, I would walk along the edge of my property, watching the glow of streetlights on foundations that weren't mine. I imagined the confrontation in court, picturing the moment when their smug faces would turn pale. There's a peculiar power in patience, especially when the people trying to take what isn't theirs are blind to it. My attorney and I devised a plan. We would let them finish construction. Every single home, every single street, every single utility line would be completed. Then, armed with deeds, court orders, and undeniable proof of ownership, we would strike. They thought they were clever, building a new world on someone else's land, but cleverness without legality is just arrogance. As the weeks passed, I maintained a calm exterior, but inside, every day was a test of patience. Watching construction crews navigate my property without permission was infuriating, yet every nail hammered into place was another step toward the dramatic courtroom revelation I envisioned. I started documenting everything, meticulously photographing homes, surveying the boundaries, keeping detailed logs of construction activities. The more they built, the more evidence I collected. It wasn't just about reclaiming the land anymore. It became about justice, about showing that no amount of arrogance, wealth, or community backing can override the law. By the time they had finished, the 96 homes were standing proudly on my land, fully furnished and seemingly occupied, but the real surprise hadn't yet arrived. I had to wait until the moment would hit them the hardest, inside a courtroom where their confidence would be stripped bare. The tension in the air was palpable the day we filed the lawsuit. Lawyers from both sides prepared their arguments, but I could see the cracks forming in the HOA representatives' expressions. They thought they were untouchable, that their homes would anchor them in some kind of legal limbo. Little did they know, their entire empire rested on nothing but sand and paper. And when the day of the trial arrived, I walked into the courtroom with a quiet smile, ready to reveal the ultimate truth. Not a single inch of my land was theirs, and every home, every street, every property improvement belonged legally to me. By the time the last roof was installed and the final street lamp flickered on my property, I had grown used to the strange sensation of walking through someone else's illusion. The homes looked perfect, like a suburban dream carefully stitched together by greedy hands, but every detail only fueled my resolve. I would stroll down the main street of what the HOA now called their development, noting the neatly trimmed lawns, the freshly painted fences, and the children playing outside, oblivious to the battle brewing beneath their feet. My lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Claire, reminded me constantly, patience was key. The more complete the development, the stronger your case, she said with a knowing smile. While the HOA celebrated the so-called completion of their project, I worked quietly behind the scenes. I hired a surveyor to walk every inch of the land with me, mapping boundaries, measuring setbacks, and documenting the encroachments in excruciating detail. Each report we compiled became a weapon, an unassailable proof that every home, every road, and every inch of infrastructure was illegally placed on my property. I even hired a photographer to capture the scene from a bird's-eye view, showing the magnitude of the HOA's audacity. Every image was a testament to their arrogance, a visual record that could not be ignored by the courts. Meanwhile, the HOA tried to pressure me into negotiation, sending letters and emails demanding compensation or threatening legal action. Their tone was smug, confident, as if the sheer presence of their homes on my land somehow gave them rights. I read every letter, every demand, and filed them carefully. They were building a paper trail that would eventually prove their ignorance and recklessness. I didn't respond directly. Not yet. Responding prematurely would dilute the impact of what was coming, and I needed the effect to be devastating. The neighbors began talking. Some were excited about the new homes, thrilled to be part of a growing community. Others whispered doubts, asking questions about the legitimacy of the development. I knew some suspected something was off, but fear and habit kept them from confronting the HOA. They watched silently as I walked my property, making notes, taking photos, and sometimes speaking quietly to Claire. I became an almost mythical presence in their eyes, a man who owned the land but let everyone pretend it was theirs. Weeks turned into months as I and my legal team prepared for the courtroom confrontation. I studied property law day and night, reviewing statutes, precedents, and loopholes. Every conversation with Claire ended with strategies on how to maximize the shock factor when the case finally went to trial. I knew the moment would be as much psychological as legal. The look on their faces when the judge confirmed that not a single home belonged to them would be unforgettable. But even as we plotted, a part of me questioned the ethics of letting people move into homes they thought they legally owned. I reminded myself that this was a matter of principle. They had trespassed, violated the law, and built a miniature city without permission. Justice required they face the consequences. Then came the day of the deposition. I sat across from the HOA representatives in a sterile office lined with legal books and certificates. They were arrogant, dismissive, and utterly convinced of their cleverness. I kept my composure, answering questions calmly, letting them reveal their assumptions and mistakes one by one. Claire had coached me to listen, to nod occasionally, and to record every slip, every inconsistency. Each time they made a claim that contradicted the deeds or the survey reports, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Their confidence was eroding, and I hadn't even taken the stand yet. One particularly tense moment came when their lead lawyer asked if I understood the potential implications of letting the homes remain occupied. I smiled faintly. I do, I said. That's why we've documented everything meticulously. Every home, every road, every utility connection. It's all evidence, not inconvenience. The lawyer's jaw tightened. I could see the panic rising subtly in the HOA representatives. They thought the homes themselves would anchor them in a legal gray area. They didn't understand that evidence can outweigh appearances. Amid the legal maneuvering, I began noticing small cracks in the HOA's unity. Some homeowners who had already moved in started reaching out to me privately, unsure about their situation. I assured them that while the legal process could be complicated, the truth would prevail. I also reminded myself that the ultimate drama was still ahead. The case wasn't just about reclaiming land, it was about teaching arrogance a lesson. I imagined the courtroom scene repeatedly, seeing their smug faces transform into disbelief as the deeds, surveys, and photographs were laid bare. I spent hours visualizing the moment the judge would ask, "Who actually owns this property?" The collective gasp, the sudden realization that every home they had so proudly built was legally mine, it was a moment worth waiting for. Yet, there was a lingering fear in the back of my mind. What if some unforeseen technicality undermined all our efforts? I countered the thought with preparation, double-checking every document, every signature, every chain of title. There would be no loophole, no excuse, no escape. And then, one quiet evening as the sun dipped behind the newly built homes, I walked through the empty streets of my land. The playgrounds were silent, the freshly paved roads glistened in the twilight, and I felt a strange sense of ownership, not just legal, but emotional. These homes were mine in every sense of the word, and soon the world would know it. Every nail hammered, every brick placed, every person who walked through those streets believing they had a claim, they were all part of the stage I had meticulously set. The HOA thought they had won by sheer audacity. They believed confidence and construction equaled legitimacy. But I knew differently. Their victory was temporary, built on sand, and the tide was about to turn. In just a few days, we would file the final motion, and the courtroom would become the arena where patience, evidence, and law combined to deliver the ultimate revelation. And as I looked at the completed homes one last time before heading back to my office, I smiled quietly to myself. They had built their dream on my land, but they had unwittingly built their undoing at the same time. The morning of the trial arrived like a storm. I drove onto my property one last time before heading to the courthouse, watching the rows of 96 homes bask in the early sunlight. They glistened with a kind of mocking perfection, as if to say, "See what we've built? Surely this is ours." But I knew better. I had waited, collected every shred of evidence, and built my case meticulously. The stage was set, and the actors were about to perform without realizing they were no longer in control. Walking into the courtroom, I felt a surge of adrenaline. Reporters crowded the gallery, curious neighbors whispered, and the HOA representatives took their seats with a mixture of arrogance and unease. I kept my composure, though inside my heart pounded. Claire had advised me to let them underestimate me. It would make the reveal all the more devastating. I nodded politely to the judge, who glanced at the enormous stack of documents on the clerk's table. "This is going to take a while," he muttered, scanning the pile. The HOA's lawyer went first, presenting their claims with the confidence of someone who believes that construction equals legitimacy. "Your Honor, these homes have been established and inhabited for months. The HOA has invested significant resources, and the property has been treated as if it were legally acquired. We request the court recognize the de facto ownership," he stated, his tone clipped but condescending. I sat silently, letting the arrogance wash over me. This was exactly the mistake I had anticipated. Their overconfidence was a trap waiting to spring. Claire began presenting our case, methodically dismantling each claim. She brought up the original deeds, tax records proving my uninterrupted ownership for decades, surveys showing every encroachment, and photographs documenting the boundaries. The judge leaned in, studying each document carefully. I could feel the tension shift subtly in the room. The HOA's smug certainty was being chipped away, brick by brick, by facts that could not be denied. At one point, the lead HOA representative attempted to interject. Objection, Your Honor. Surely the fact that these homes were constructed and are inhabited should factor into the legal interpretation. Overruled. The judge interrupted. Ownership is not determined by convenience or occupation. Documentation and legal title determine property rights. I felt a thrill of satisfaction. Their faces tightened, their confidence cracking. Every claim they had made, every attempt to intimidate me, every document they tried to manipulate was being exposed for what it truly was, a house of cards. Claire's voice was calm but firm as she laid out how each of the 96 homes rested on my property, built without permission, and in complete violation of property law. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Claire called me to the stand. I stood, walked to the witness box, and looked directly at the HOA members. They had watched me calmly endure months of intrusion, and now they had to confront me face to face. Do you recognize these homes? She asked, pointing to the aerial photographs spread across the projector. Yes, I said, voice steady. Every single one was built on my land without my consent. The room went silent. Whispers spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Some homeowners looked shocked, others confused. The HOA representatives' confident expressions had vanished, replaced by a kind of disbelief that bordered on panic. They had assumed they could bully, manipulate, and push me aside, but the reality was undeniable. Every home, every street, every structure was legally mine. The judge leaned forward. You are claiming ownership of all 96 homes? He asked. Yes, Your Honor. The properties were built on my land without permission. I have every legal right to reclaim them. I replied. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Some of the homeowners began whispering questions to each other. One woman looked at her husband and asked quietly, How is this possible? We signed papers, we moved in. Claire smiled slightly. You didn't sign any legal documents transferring ownership. They assume possession does not equate ownership. Then came the most dramatic moment. I handed the judge the original deed to the property, the one that had been in my family for decades. I watched as he examined it, flipping through the pages, cross-referencing dates and signatures. The courtroom was tense. Even the judge's expression reflected surprise at the meticulous clarity of the ownership record. The HOA representatives were visibly shaken now. Their whispers turned to frantic discussions, and I could hear snippets. This can't be, we spent so much money, and what are we supposed to do now? They had built their empire on my land, confident that action equaled rights. But the law was a far more unforgiving judge than any human arrogance could anticipate. Then the judge spoke, his voice steady but firm. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that the 96 homes in question were constructed on property owned by the plaintiff without authorization. The court recognizes full ownership rights to the plaintiff. I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. My patience, my planning, and my meticulous documentation had paid off. The HOA members sat frozen, their mouths slightly open, unable to process the verdict fully. They had believed that speed, construction, and audacity could substitute for legality, and now they were witnessing the collapse of everything they had assumed to be theirs. At that moment, I realized the full impact of what had just occurred. Every home they had so proudly built, every road they had paved, every utility connection they had installed, it was all irrelevant. All their time, money, and effort had been invested into a property that was never theirs. The courtroom was a mix of astonishment, disbelief, and in some cases, quiet panic. And as I walked out of the witness stand, I couldn't help but think, sometimes the best revenge is patience, strategy, and letting people believe they are winning until the moment they realize they were never in control. But the drama wasn't over yet. There is still the question of the homeowners, the people living in the houses who had unknowingly become part of the mess. How would they react to learning that their homes belonged legally to someone else? Could I enforce my rights immediately, or would the court require mediation to resolve their tenancy? And as I considered the next steps, I couldn't help but smile, because the climax, the final twist of the story, was yet to come. The verdict had barely settled before the weight of reality hit the HOA representatives. Their 96 homes, once symbols of greed and audacity, now sat firmly under my legal control. The courtroom was still buzzing with whispers as the judge outlined the next steps. He confirmed that while I held full ownership of the property, the situation with the homeowners, many of whom had purchased or rented under the HOA's authority, would require formal mediation to protect innocent parties. I nodded silently. My goal was never to harm ordinary people who were unaware. My aim was justice, and justice had been delivered in spades. After leaving the courthouse, I returned to the land that had caused so much turmoil. Walking through the streets, I could see the stunned faces of the HOA leaders peering from windows, knowing that every brick, every nail, every structure they had so proudly built belonged to someone else entirely. It was surreal. The quiet pride that once radiated from their community offices and construction sites had evaporated, replaced by a kind of frozen disbelief. Some residents had begun calling neighbors, discussing rumors of legal ownership and the shocking courtroom revelation. It was as if the ground itself had shifted beneath them, and no amount of explanation could restore their confidence. I met with Claire and my legal team later that evening to plan the transition. We needed to handle the homeowners delicately, as many had bought properties in good faith, unaware of the fraudulent claims made by the HOA. Our approach was meticulous: formal notices, clear explanations of ownership rights, and offers to assist with relocation or legal agreements for continued occupancy under my terms. It was important that the public perception of the resolution reflected fairness, not cruelty, even as the former HOA leaders reeled from the consequences of their actions. The next few weeks were tense but productive. Letters went out to homeowners explaining that while the land belonged to me, they would be given options to remain as tenants or renegotiate purchase agreements directly with me. Many were shocked, some even angry, but most were relieved to learn they weren't being evicted without cause. I made it clear that while I held the ultimate legal authority, my goal was resolution, not retribution. And yet, the HOA leadership, the same people who had orchestrated the audacious construction on my property, could barely meet my gaze when I walked past. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had spent months trying to assert ownership over my land, and now they were powerless spectators in the life they had helped create, but could no longer claim. Every day, I would stroll along the streets, imagining what they must be feeling. The perfectly manicured lawns, the freshly painted houses, and the sidewalks that had been meticulously built by their crews were mine to command. Yet I refrained from gloating. The satisfaction lay in the quiet acknowledgement that patience, evidence, and careful planning had allowed me to turn their audacity into their undoing. They had underestimated the power of the law, and in doing so had sealed their own humiliation. The HOA leaders tried everything they could think of: appeals, threats, even informal negotiations, but every attempt failed because the evidence was indisputable. Every foundation, every utility hookup, every deed-backed survey was a testament to my patience and legal preparation. The final humiliation came in a private meeting where I laid out the full scale of their losses. Their faces drained of color as I detailed not just the legal ownership, but the financial consequences of the misappropriation. They had assumed they could build a new community without oversight, but now, with my control established, the reality was crushing. I remember walking past one particular house where the HOA president had moved in. I stopped briefly to glance at the mailbox. The house looked normal, ordinary even, but it stood on my land, and yet I felt no urge to disrupt the residents unnecessarily. I simply smiled quietly, knowing that the people who had tried to seize what wasn't theirs were the ones who were truly defeated. Their arrogance had been met not with anger, but with calculated patience, and that was far more satisfying. Months later, the land was fully under my control, the homeowners either having formalized agreements with me or relocated with assistance. The 96 homes, the streets, the parks, all were legally mine, yet the drama of what had unfolded remained a vivid memory. The HOA had attempted a power grab on a scale that was unprecedented, and they had failed spectacularly. In the end, the lesson was clear. Patience, preparation, and adherence to principle will always outweigh arrogance, greed, and recklessness. Walking through the streets, one final time, I reflected on the journey. What had begun as a quiet inheritance had become a battlefield of wills, a test of strategy and resolve. The HOA had built their dream atop my land, but in doing so, they had unknowingly scripted their own downfall. And as the sun set behind the rows of homes, my homes, I realized something profound. Sometimes the most satisfying victories aren't loud or dramatic. They are quiet, deliberate, and complete. The people who believed they were untouchable had learned a lesson they would never forget. And I had reclaimed what was mine, not through confrontation, but through patience, evidence, and the unshakable certainty of justice.